So I'm Andrew Tuck. I'm the editor of Monocle magazine. We've been around since 2007. So we have the magazine, we have a radio station, Monocle 24, on which every show gets made into a podcast. We produce books, and unusually for a media company, we also have some physical spaces. We have some shops around the world, and we have some cafes too. So we're making lots of direct contact with our readers and listeners. Those little cafes run as mini embassies. So it's a small but very varied media company. Well, I came up through journalism as a pretty varied journalist. I worked for a magazine here in London, first of all, called Time Out, which was an arts and culture magazine covering the city of London. And then I moved to a newspaper group. I worked for the independent newspapers, where I ran variously the Saturday and the Sunday magazines, which always had architecture pages and design pages. So my interest began there as a journalist. Now, when we went to Monocle, very early on in that first year, we did a quality of life survey looking at what makes great cities. And a huge part of that is the built environment. So it's how urbanism happens, how architecture happens, how design happens. But I hope to explain later on, for us, design isn't something that happens in its own space. You know, design impacts, for example, if you're in the diplomatic service and you want to work in a good embassy that represents your nation. So we've tried to find the ways that architecture affects all of our lives in many varied forms, rather than thinking of it as a single building that you go to, you admire, but you don't think about the context. So I guess what's interesting about Monocle is we saw an opportunity to write often about smaller practices, younger architects, even architecture that had been around for a while. In the past 10 years, much of the conversation has been dominated, not surprisingly, by a few names, by grand projects, which are extraordinary, which have been used by nations as a piece of soft power to sell themselves around the world. And again, we're interested in that story. But when it comes to our readers, many of those people are maybe running a business and they want to be in a good office, or they manufacturing something. They care about making a factory even that uses architecture to enrich the lives of the people that work there. We wanted to look at all sorts of design and architecture. So our viewpoint has often been to deliberately not cover the biggest projects and the most famous names who dominate the headlines. We've always looked for this idea that it should be tactile and human, of a scale that people can relate to. We've also never run CADs or mock-ups of buildings in the magazine. We always want to see the finished product. We want to see how it comes to life. And I think for us, there is, of course, an important role for architectural magazines to cover projects the minute they are finished, even through the design stage. But for us, the most important thing is then how a building gets used. So even when it comes to domestic architecture, and someone says, we've finished a new house, you can shoot it before the people move in, that isn't very interesting to us. We think people want to see it lived in. They want to see, can it cope with some kids and a dog and a rainy day? We're not after perfection. We're after how these buildings will age, the patina they take on. And just one other tiny thing on that. That's why we've often covered older buildings and older houses, because I think the idea that you buy a house and you sell it after 3 years and you get another house, and that's not quite where our readers are. We're trying to say to people, if you have the opportunity to make the commitment to building a house, why not try and make a home, for example, you'd like to be in forever? And the same when it comes to making spaces to work from. Let's not get caught up in the latest fashions and trends. Let's try to make spaces that make people feel good, safe, inspired. And oddly, that is more important than ever before as we talk at the midst of a pandemic. So I don't know why, a bit crazy, but many years ago we decided that rather than doing an iPad version or being super digital, that we would move into radio. So we used to have a single podcast we did every Sunday, but we jumped from doing that to a 24-hour radio station called Monocle 24. And at the start, I wanted to do this podcast about cities because there didn't seem at that time to be many people. This is almost 10 years ago now, covering what makes good cities. And we saw an interesting gap because everybody's passionate about their city. They understand often how it works better than the people who are their council members or their mayors. They know how the neighborhood works. They know what it needs. And there's amazing conversations going on around urbanism. What's interesting is those conversations are often happening in specialist places. You know, they're happening at conferences, or they're happening at City Hall, or they're happening in academia. So you have all this conversation going on around cities, which is super important, but never gets translated to the public. And meanwhile, the public is often having a really interesting conversation that doesn't make the journey the other way. So the big ambition, and it doesn't always work, but the big ambition for the Urbanist is to sit in the middle and to talk about what's happening on both sides, but in very simple language. So our audience is intelligent and bright. Most of them probably know more about urbanism than me. But my job is to convene a conversation every week about what makes a good city and the things that we need to do, but to do it in very straightforward language that everybody feels, okay, I can be part of this conversation.
And the guests that you invite in the Urbanist conversations are different, no?
Yeah, so it could be anybody that has an impact on the city. So we've in recent weeks, we spoke to the urbanist Jan Gehl, now in his 80s. We caught up with him at home in Copenhagen to get the long view about urbanism, because I think everyone is making a lot of very fast decisions at the moment. You know, our cities will never be the same. It's a death of shared space. Nobody will go on public transport ever again. But when you speak to somebody who's 80, 85 or 83 now, I think, he says, hold on, let's wait and see. Let's decide in 6 months and a year. There are some things that will change now that will stick and will change forever. But there are a lot of things about human nature that mean we're going to come back as communities. We want to be with each other. We don't want to spend the rest of our lives 2 meters away from the people we know, our neighbors and our friends. So that was important. But we've just done an episode about food in the city. But we've done everything from leisure and sport to more academic topics as well. So it's anybody who has a story to tell about their city and about how to make cities better. Well, it's funny. I think the last couple of months have been terrible for the world in many ways, a really awful period. But I think for journalists, and especially at Monocle, it's given us a reason for what we do. It's given us a real sense of purpose. And the numbers of people coming to the podcast are incredible. But what's more interesting is the number of people who now write to me after each show. So people are really, really thinking about what happens to their cities. And we've done lots of special shows about public realm and what's happening in the cities at this time. So for me, strangely, this has been one of the best periods because I feel people have seen their communities come together. They've seen how their cities function as never before. Even where I live, I live in a small street in the centre of London. This road is pulled together as a community in fascinating ways that I would never have guessed just a few months ago. And this has empowered people to think about their cities. So people want to keep this period of passion. They want to make sure that the things they see that are good in their city aren't lost, whether that's additional bike lanes or it's an ease of walking around their city, but especially a sense of connection and community. So that's what we've been campaigning about over the last few weeks. How do we find the positive in this moment? And as I said, be stupid and think everything's going to change forever. But how do we find the positives at this time? So I'm really happy with the show at the moment. It's kind of found its stride and its meaning in a really interesting way. Yeah, I think when it's not, when a show hasn't been as successful as you'd hope, first of all, you have to question yourself. You think, okay, what did I do there? And sometimes it is down to me. Sometimes it's the storytelling. It's like it's great to get a good interview. It's great to get 4 or 5 good interviews, but unless you connect those elements together and you present them in a way that is both entertaining and informative, then it can be a little bit difficult. And also, we've gone sometimes to those big city conferences and spoken to amazing people. But sometimes that's quite complicated then to take an event and present it to people on a radio show when you've seen something that's visual. So we've been a little bit more cautious about doing those things, using them more as places to meet people rather than just retelling their story. So it's down to storytelling, and that's. And if anyone gets told off about that, that's me. That's my. That's because I haven't probably done as good a job as I should have done. Well, I think there's a few complicated things for architecture because it's not like, if it was interior design, it's a very simple idea and it's one discipline. But architecture covers so many things and so many skills. It's both incredibly technical. It backs into the world of engineering. It takes flight as a thing about beauty and cultural stories. It's about physical space, but also about ideas in our minds. So it's a very complicated thing. It's covering so many different bases at one time. It involves psychology and everything. I think that sometimes for the public, they don't get to see the bit where it's going to change their lives. And that's the important thing. So whether it's a cultural institution or it's the building of a neighborhood, sometimes architects are so confident about what they're doing, they forget to make the connection with the end user. I think they worry that if they take too much information from the end user, their big idea will get watered down. But sometimes it means at the end of the process, they're not very good at explaining why this is important. But oddly, I think people care about architecture in a huge way. But I think there's a huge audience for the world of architecture, and people are passionate about it. If you tell those stories and if you get them out of the world of speaking in an architectural language, then I think we're all fascinated by what gets built and made, and yes, how it can change our lives. When you turn on the TV in any country, you'll see good shows about, I don't know, how to build a house. There's this domestic level of architectural engagement, but beyond that, they stumble a little bit on, especially in the TV world, to explain architecture in interesting ways. And then the only other way that it really kind of makes headlines is when there's a star architect involved. So this huge middle ground, which is the more important in a way, which is often a residential project or a retail project that's rethinking how things are done. Again, I think that some of the best architecture in the moment is being done about trying to generate communities where you have people of various ages living together, for example, or where you consider healthcare, important now. Just think about building hospitals, how important that is. That's architecture and design. Those are the stories that we've been slow at telling, and I think it's really important going forward that we understand, even something as simple as how an architect gets involved in making a hospital can affect the outcomes of people's healthcare, their mental well-being. The same for schools. Just think of the impact that an architect can have on education if that is done well. And that's the bit that we need to begin to explain to people in better ways. And again, at Monocle, we try to dive into those stories of all sorts of things of healthcare and education. But even we need to do more of it. It's an important job for all of us.